I never thought I'd feel so utterly invisible in my own home. One morning, I woke up to the unbearable news that my own son had tried to sell the house I built with my hands, a $7.4 million property in the heart of Chicago's Gold Coast, while I was thousands of miles away, traveling. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife could ever reach. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. For the past 47 years, I've lived in this massive brownstone on Oak Street, just 2 blocks from the lake. The house stands 4 stories tall, with limestone walls that have weathered Chicago winters since 1892. I remember the day my late husband Thomas and I bought it from an estate sale. We were young then, our hands calloused from the renovation work we did ourselves. Thomas was a structural engineer, and I was a pediatric nurse at Northwestern Memorial. Together, we transformed that crumbling Victorian mansion into something magnificent. The morning I discovered Michael's betrayal, I was standing in my marble foyer, still wearing my traveling clothes from the red-eye flight from New York. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through 17 missed calls and 12 urgent emails. The Persian rug beneath my feet, the one Thomas and I had bought during our honeymoon in Istanbul, suddenly felt like quicksand. I could smell the familiar mixture of lemon oil and aged wood that had always meant home to me, but that morning, it smelled like deception. The email from my real estate agent, Patricia Hoffman, was time-stamped at 9:43 the previous evening. Eleanor, we need to discuss the listing attempt on your Oak Street property immediately. There are legal implications we must address. My chest tightened as I read those words. Listing attempt. Legal implications. The phrases bounced around in my mind like pinballs, each impact more painful than the last. I walked slowly to my kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. The morning light streamed through the bay windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts. I made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, the same ritual I'd performed every morning for decades, but my hands trembled so violently that the porcelain cup rattled against the saucer. That's when I noticed the stack of documents on my kitchen island. Real estate contracts. Appraisal reports. A power of attorney form with my signature that looked suspiciously shaky. But it wasn't my signature. I knew my own handwriting better than anyone. For 50 years, I'd signed medical charts, birthday cards, Christmas gifts, mortgage papers, and tax returns. This signature was a forgery, crude and desperate. My own son had committed fraud, using my name to try to sell the house that contained every precious memory of my adult life. I sank into one of my kitchen chairs, the same chairs where I'd fed baby food to Michael and his sister Sarah decades ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the table where we'd shared thousands of family dinners, where I'd helped with homework, where I'd listened to teenage heartbreaks and celebrated college acceptances. Now it was the scene of the most devastating betrayal I'd ever experienced. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Patricia's voice was gentle but concerned. Eleanor, I'm so sorry to bother you this early, but we have a serious situation. Yesterday afternoon, a man claiming to be you called my office, identifying himself as Michael Thompson, your son. He said he had your power of attorney and wanted to list the property immediately for $6.8 million. $6.8 million. Nearly $600,000 below market value. My hands clenched into fists as Patricia continued. He became quite aggressive when I explained our standard verification procedures. He insisted the sale was urgent due to your declining health and mounting medical bills. Eleanor, I've known you for 15 years. You've never mentioned any health issues, and certainly nothing that would require such a drastic step. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. Patricia, I'm in perfect health, and I never gave anyone permission to sell my house. What Michael did was fraud, plain and simple. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice heavy with sympathy. Eleanor, I'm afraid there's more. He also contacted 2 other agencies in the neighborhood. One of them actually showed the property to 3 potential buyers yesterday afternoon while you were still traveling. My heart stopped. Strangers had walked through my home, evaluating my possessions, planning their own lives in the spaces where I'd built mine. They'd stood in my bedroom, where Thomas had died peacefully in my arms 7 years ago. They'd walked through Sarah's old room, still decorated with her high school track ribbons and college photos. They'd examined my kitchen, where I'd baked birthday cakes and prepared holiday feasts for a family that now saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their inheritance. After hanging up with Patricia, I sat alone in my kitchen as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The house felt different somehow, as if Michael's betrayal had contaminated the very air I breathed. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the old wooden floor sounded more ominous. This wasn't just my home anymore, it was a crime scene. I walked slowly through each room, seeing everything with new eyes. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents for 35 years. The den where Thomas had taught Michael to play chess. The sunroom where I'd nursed both children through countless illnesses, reading them stories and bringing them soup. Now these sacred spaces felt violated, tainted by greed and deception. In my study, I opened the mahogany filing cabinet where I kept all our important documents. Thomas had been meticulous about organization, and I'd maintained his system after his death. Birth certificates, marriage license, insurance policies, investment records, everything was exactly where it should be. Except for one thing. The original deed to the house, the one we'd signed when we first bought it, was missing. My hands shook as I searched through every folder, every envelope, every loose paper. The deed was nowhere to be found. Michael had taken it. He'd been in my house while I was away, going through my private papers, stealing the documents he needed to support his fraudulent scheme. The violation felt as intimate and brutal as if he'd physically assaulted me. I sank into Thomas's old leather chair, the one he'd used for 40 years of evening reading. The worn arms still held the impression of his hands, and I could almost smell the pipe tobacco he'd given up when the children were young. "What should I do, Thomas?" I whispered to the empty room. "How did we raise a son capable of this?" The memories began flooding back, unbidden and unwelcome. I remembered the first time I'd questioned Michael's character. He was 16, and I'd caught him stealing $20 from my purse. When I confronted him, he'd looked me straight in the eye and lied, insisting he was borrowing it for lunch money and planned to pay me back. The lie was so smooth, so convincing, that for a moment I'd almost believed him. But the money had been my tip from a particularly difficult shift at the hospital, and I'd counted it twice before putting it in my purse. That should have been my first warning. But like so many parents, I'd made excuses. He was just a teenager testing boundaries. He was under pressure at school. He'd learn from this mistake and grow into a responsible adult. I'd been so wrong. Over the years, there had been other incidents. In college, he'd forged my signature on loan documents without my knowledge, leaving me liable for thousands of dollars in debt when he dropped out junior year. After his father's death, he'd convinced me to co-sign for a business loan, promising that his new consulting firm would make us all wealthy. The business failed within 2 years, and I'd spent my entire savings paying off the debt to protect my credit rating. Each time, I'd told myself it was the last time. Each time, I'd believed his promises to change, to be more responsible, to treat me with the respect I deserved. And each time, I'd been disappointed. But this was different. This wasn't just financial irresponsibility or poor judgment. This was calculated fraud, a deliberate attempt to steal everything I'd worked for and leave me homeless in my old age. The phone rang again, jarring me from my painful memories. This time it was Sarah, my daughter, calling from her home in Portland. "Mom, I heard you're back from your trip. How was New York?" Her voice sounded normal, cheerful even, as if nothing had happened. As if her brother hadn't just attempted to commit a felony using my name. "Sarah, did you know about Michael's plan to sell the house?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, becoming defensive and slightly accusatory. "Mom, we've been worried about you. Living alone in that big house at your age, it's not safe. And the expenses must be overwhelming. Michael was just trying to help. Just trying to help." The phrase hit me like a slap across the face. Help by committing fraud? Help by forging my signature? Help by planning to steal my home while I was out of town? "You're being dramatic, Mom. Michael loves you. We all love you. But sometimes love means making difficult decisions, even when the other person doesn't understand at first." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own daughter was defending her brother's criminal behavior, trying to gaslight me into accepting theft as love. "Sarah, I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my property. I don't need a 38-year-old son or a 35-year-old daughter to manage my life. Mom, you're not getting any younger. What if you fall down those stairs? What if you have a medical emergency and no one finds you for days? We're just thinking about your safety and well-being." Safety and well-being. My children had never shown much interest in my safety and well-being when Thomas was dying of cancer and I was caring for him around the clock while still working full-time at the hospital. They hadn't worried about my well-being when I developed pneumonia last winter and spent 3 days in the hospital with no visitors because they were both too busy to drive across town. But now, suddenly, they were concerned enough to commit fraud on my behalf. "Sarah, if you're so worried about my well-being, why didn't Michael discuss this with me before forging my signature and attempting to sell my house?" Another long pause. "He tried to talk to you about it before you left for New York, but you refused to listen. You got all defensive and emotional, just like you're doing now. He was trying to handle things quietly to avoid upsetting you." The lies came so easily to her, so smoothly, that I wondered if she'd been practicing. Michael had never mentioned selling the house before my trip. Our last conversation had been about his latest business venture, another get-rich-quick scheme that he wanted me to invest in. I'd told him no, that I was done funding his failures, and he'd hung up on me in anger. Sarah, I want you to listen very carefully. Michael committed fraud by forging my signature. He attempted to sell my property without my knowledge or consent. That's a felony. And if you continue to defend him and try to manipulate me into accepting this behavior, you'll be complicit in his crimes. Mom, you're scaring me. You're talking like we're criminals or something. We're your children. Everything we do is because we love you and want what's best for you. Love. There was that word again, wielded like a weapon to justify betrayal. If you love me, Sarah, you'll support my right to make my own decisions about my own property. If you love me, you'll condemn Michael's fraud instead of making excuses for it. I think you need to calm down and think about this rationally. Maybe you should talk to Dr. Peterson about adjusting your medication. These paranoid thoughts aren't healthy. Paranoid thoughts. Now she was questioning my mental health, trying to paint me as a confused old woman who couldn't tell the difference between reality and delusion. It was a cruel and calculated attack, designed to undermine my credibility and make me doubt my own perceptions. I hung up without another word. Sitting alone in my study, I realized that my children weren't just trying to steal my house. They were trying to steal my dignity, my autonomy, my very sense of self. They wanted me to believe that I was too old, too confused, too incompetent to manage my own affairs. They wanted me to accept their control over my life, their right to make decisions for me, their authority to dispose of my property as they saw fit. But I wasn't confused. I wasn't incompetent. And I wasn't going to let them destroy everything Thomas and I had built together. The next morning, I called my attorney, Robert Klein, a man I'd known since he was a young associate in his father's law firm 30 years ago. Robert had handled Thomas's estate planning, and I'd trusted him with all my legal affairs ever since. His voice was warm and familiar when he answered the phone, but it grew serious as I explained the situation. Eleanor, what you're describing is elder abuse, financial fraud, and identity theft. These are serious federal crimes, especially given the value of the property involved. We need to act quickly to protect your interests and document everything for potential prosecution. Within hours, Robert had filed a police report and contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. He'd also sent cease and desist letters to all the real estate agencies Michael had contacted, formally notifying them that any attempts to sell or transfer my property were unauthorized and fraudulent. But most importantly, he'd helped me understand that I wasn't alone in this fight. Eleanor, I've seen this kind of thing more often than you'd imagine. Adult children who see their elderly parents as ATMs rather than human beings deserving of respect and dignity. What makes your case particularly egregious is the sophisticated nature of the fraud and the high value of the property. The federal prosecutors take these cases very seriously. That afternoon, I received a call from Special Agent Maria Rodriguez of the FBI's Chicago field office. Her voice was professional but compassionate as she explained the investigation process. Mrs. Thompson, we've reviewed the documentation provided by your attorney, and we have enough evidence to open a formal investigation into wire fraud, mail fraud, and elder abuse. We'll need to interview you in detail about your son's access to your personal documents and financial information. As I prepared for the FBI interview, I couldn't help but think about how surreal my life had become. 3 days ago, I'd been a retired nurse enjoying a medical conference in New York, presenting a paper on pediatric pain management to my former colleagues. Now I was the victim of a federal crime, perpetrated by my own son. The interview took place in a sterile conference room at the FBI building downtown. Agent Rodriguez was joined by Agent James Walsh, a specialist in financial fraud cases. They were both professional and respectful, but their questions were thorough and sometimes painful. Mrs. Thompson, can you walk us through your relationship with your son over the past few years? Has he exhibited any pattern of financial irresponsibility or deceptive behavior? I found myself recounting decades of disappointment and betrayal. The forged loan documents in college. The failed businesses I'd funded. The constant requests for money, always accompanied by promises of repayment that never materialized. The gradual erosion of respect and affection, replaced by a cold calculation of what I could provide for them financially. Has your son expressed any resentment about your ownership of the Oak Street property? Has he made any statements suggesting he believes he's entitled to inherit or control the house? The memory hit me like a physical blow. It was Christmas dinner 2 years ago, just a few months after I'd refused to invest in Michael's latest business venture. We were sitting around the dining room table, the same table where we'd celebrated so many holidays as a happy family. Sarah had been complaining about the cost of her mortgage payments in Portland, and Michael had been drinking too much wine. You know, Mom, he'd said, his words slightly slurred, it's pretty selfish of you to keep this whole house to yourself when Sarah and I are struggling financially. Dad would have wanted us to share in the wealth you're sitting on. He wouldn't have wanted you hoarding resources while your children suffer." At the time, I'd been so shocked by his audacity that I'd barely responded. I'd mumbled something about the house being my home and changed the subject. But looking back, I could see it was more than just drunken complaining. It was a statement of entitlement, a declaration that he viewed my property as rightfully his. Agent Rodriguez made notes as I spoke, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When I finished recounting that Christmas dinner conversation, she looked up from her notepad with a grim expression. "Mrs. Thompson, what your son said constitutes a verbal expression of intent to defraud. Combined with his subsequent actions, it helps establish premeditation. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a misunderstanding. He's been planning this for some time." The investigation moved quickly. Within a week, agents had interviewed the real estate agents Michael had contacted, obtained copies of all the forged documents, and traced the phone calls he'd made to various title companies and mortgage brokers. They'd also executed search warrants on his phone records and email accounts, uncovering a trail of communications that revealed the full scope of his scheme. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Jenkins, my neighbor across the street, had been keeping an informal eye on my house while I was away. She'd noticed Michael's car in my driveway several times during the 2 weeks I was in New York, and she'd seen him carrying boxes and files out of the house. Being a thoughtful neighbor, she'd taken photos with her phone, thinking I might want to know about his visits. Those photos showed Michael removing documents from my study, loading them into his car, and returning the next day with what appeared to be photocopying equipment. Mrs. Jenkins had unknowingly documented the theft of my personal papers and the creation of the forged documents he'd used to attempt the property sale. "I hope Michael knows how lucky he is to have such a devoted mother," Agent Rodriguez said as she reviewed Mrs. Jenkins' photos. "Most people in your situation would be demanding immediate prosecution and the maximum possible sentence. But you've asked us to give him a chance to make things right before we file formal charges." It was true. Despite everything he'd done, despite the betrayal and the fraud and the complete lack of respect for my autonomy, Michael was still my son. I still remembered the little boy who'd brought me dandelions from the backyard and insisted they were the most beautiful flowers in the world. I still remembered the teenager who'd cried in my arms when his first girlfriend broke his heart. I still remembered the young man who delivered a touching eulogy at his father's funeral, speaking about the values Thomas had taught him about integrity and family loyalty. But those memories were becoming harder to reconcile with the man who'd tried to steal my home. The confrontation came on a gray October morning, 2 weeks after the FBI had opened their investigation. Robert had arranged for the meeting to take place in his law office, a neutral location where emotions might be kept under better control. Michael arrived first, accompanied by his own attorney, a nervous-looking young man who kept glancing at his phone as if hoping for an easier case to present itself. When I walked into the conference room, Michael looked older than his 38 years. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes had the desperate look of a cornered animal. For just a moment, I felt a pang of maternal concern. Then I remembered the forged signature on the power of attorney documents, and my sympathy evaporated. "Hello, Michael," I said, taking a seat across from him at the polished conference table. "Mom, thank God you're here. There's been a huge misunderstanding, and I need you to call off these lawyers and FBI agents so we can work this out as a family." His words carried the same manipulative tone I'd been hearing for years, the same attempt to frame his criminal behavior as a simple misunderstanding that could be resolved with family forgiveness and selective amnesia. Robert opened a file folder and spread out copies of the forged documents. "Mr. Thompson, these signatures don't match your mother's handwriting. The FBI's handwriting analysts have confirmed that they're forgeries. Can you explain how documents bearing your mother's forged signature came to be in the possession of multiple real estate agencies?" Michael's attorney whispered something in his ear, and he shook his head. "I want to talk to my mother alone. This is a family matter, and we don't need lawyers and federal agents complicating things." "Michael," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "the moment you forged my signature and tried to sell my house without my knowledge or consent, this stopped being a family matter and became a federal crime. You're not going to manipulate your way out of this one." His expression changed then, the mask of wounded innocence slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "You're really going to destroy your own son over money? Over a house you're too old to take care of anyway?" "I'm not destroying you, Michael. You've destroyed yourself. I'm simply refusing to be your victim anymore." "Victim? Jesus, Mom, listen to yourself. I'm trying to help you. That house is worth millions, but your property taxes alone are costing you $30,000 a year. The maintenance and utilities are another $20,000. You're hemorrhaging money to maintain a property you can't properly use or enjoy. I was trying to help you liquidate an asset so you could live comfortably for the rest of your life instead of being house poor." The lies flowed so smoothly, with such apparent sincerity, that I could see how he'd manipulated me for so many years. He'd taken just enough truth, the house was expensive to maintain, the property taxes were substantial, and twisted it to justify his criminal behavior. Michael, if you were genuinely concerned about my financial situation, you could have discussed it with me directly. You could have suggested hiring a property manager, or converting part of the house into rental units, or any number of legitimate solutions. Instead, you chose to forge my signature and commit fraud. Because I knew you'd be too stubborn and emotional to make a rational decision. You're too attached to that house to see it clearly. Sometimes children have to make hard decisions for their parents, even when the parents don't understand or appreciate it at first. There it was again, the twisted logic that painted theft as love, fraud as family responsibility. He genuinely seemed to believe that his criminal behavior was justified by his assessment of my needs and capabilities. Robert leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, your mother is 73 years old, but she's in excellent health and full possession of her mental faculties. She's perfectly capable of making her own decisions about her property. You had no legal authority to act on her behalf, and forging her signature constitutes multiple serious felonies. Michael turned back to me, his expression softening into the look he'd perfected as a child when trying to avoid punishment for misbehavior. Mom, I know I made mistakes. I should have talked to you first. But everything I did was motivated by love and concern for your welfare. Can we work this out without involving the government? For a moment, I was transported back 30 years to similar conversations about smaller transgressions. Michael breaking a neighbor's window with a baseball and lying about it. Michael plagiarizing a school paper and begging me not to tell his father. Michael stealing money from my purse and promising it would never happen again. Each time, I'd forgiven him. Each time, I'd believed his promises to change. And each time, the behavior had escalated. Michael, this isn't a mistake you made. This was a calculated scheme that involved weeks of planning, multiple forged documents, and attempts to sell my property to strangers. It wasn't motivated by love or concern. It was motivated by greed and a complete disrespect for my rights as the property owner. His facade finally cracked completely. Fine. You want to know the truth? Sarah and I are tired of watching you waste resources while we struggle to pay our bills. That house should have been in trust for us years ago. Dad always said family takes care of family, but you've become selfish and paranoid in your old age. Selfish? Michael, over the past 15 years, I've given you over $200,000 to pay your debts, fund your failed businesses, and bail you out of financial crises. I've never asked for repayment, never demanded gratitude, never insisted on oversight of how the money was spent. How is that selfish? Because you could afford to give more. You're sitting on millions of dollars in real estate equity while your children live paycheck to paycheck. If you really loved us, you'd help us buy homes of our own instead of hoarding wealth in a house that's too big for one person. The entitlement in his voice was breathtaking. He genuinely believed that my financial resources belonged to him and Sarah, that I was merely a temporary custodian of wealth that was rightfully theirs. In his mind, my refusal to give them unlimited access to my assets was a betrayal of parental responsibility. Michael, I've worked for 50 years to build financial security for my retirement. Your father and I sacrificed and saved to buy that house and pay off the mortgage. We've maintained and improved it for decades, turning it into a valuable asset. That value belongs to me, not to you. But what happens when you die? It's all going to come to us anyway, right? So why make us wait when we need help now? The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. My own son was essentially arguing that he should have access to his inheritance while I was still alive, that my death was simply an inconvenient delay in his access to what he considered his rightful property. Robert broke the silence. Mr. Thompson, your mother's will is private and confidential. You have no guarantee of inheriting anything, and attempting to access an inheritance through fraud while the owner is still living is elder abuse under federal law. Michael's attorney finally spoke up. Perhaps we could discuss a settlement that would avoid criminal prosecution while addressing the underlying family disputes. No, I said firmly. This isn't a civil dispute that can be resolved with money. Michael committed multiple felonies. He violated my trust, my privacy, and my autonomy. He needs to face the consequences of his actions. But even as I said the words, I knew I didn't have the stomach for a lengthy criminal prosecution that would inevitably destroy what remained of our family relationships. Sarah would never forgive me for sending her brother to prison, even though she'd been complicit in his scheme. My grandchildren would grow up knowing their uncle was a convicted felon because of their grandmother's vindictiveness. Agent Rodriguez called me that evening with an update on the investigation. Mrs. Thompson, we've completed our preliminary investigation, and we have more than enough evidence to prosecute your son for mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. The federal sentencing guidelines suggest he'd face 3 to 5 years in prison if convicted. But I understand you have mixed feelings about proceeding with prosecution. Agent Rodriguez, I want Michael to face consequences for what he's done. But I also want to give him one last chance to make things right without destroying the entire family. That's your choice, Mrs. Thompson, but I want you to understand the implications. If you decide not to press charges, there's nothing to prevent him from attempting something like this again. Financial predators rarely reform without facing serious consequences. That night, I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of my house settling around me. The building was over 100 years old, and it had its own personality. The floorboards creaked in a specific pattern when someone walked down the hallway. The heating pipes clicked and groaned as the steam circulated through the radiators. The windows rattled softly when the wind blew off Lake Michigan. These sounds had comforted me for decades, the acoustic fingerprint of home. But now they felt different, tainted by the knowledge that Michael had walked through these rooms while I was away, violating my privacy and planning my financial ruin. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of his footsteps. Every groan of the pipe sounded like the house itself expressing pain at the betrayal it had witnessed. I got up and walked to my study, turning on the desk lamp Thomas had used for his evening correspondence. The room still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, even after 7 years. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one where he'd kept his most private papers, and pulled out a leather-bound journal he'd started in the months before his death. Thomas had been a methodical man, and his journal entries were precise and thoughtful. I'd read them many times in the years since his death, finding comfort in his familiar handwriting and his gentle observations about our life together. But tonight, I was looking for specific entries about Michael and Sarah, hoping to find some guidance from the man who'd known them as children. I found what I was looking for in an entry dated just 3 months before Thomas's death. He'd been reflecting on the children's visit for his 70th birthday, and his words were uncharacteristically harsh. Eleanor worries that I'm too hard on the children, but I'm concerned about their character development. Michael, in particular, seems to view our financial resources as his safety net rather than our hard-earned security. When I mentioned updating our wills, he seemed more interested in the inheritance provisions than in our healthcare directives or funeral preferences. Sarah is more subtle, but she shares his sense of entitlement. They both seem to assume our property will eventually be theirs, without considering that we might need those resources for our own care as we age. I worry about Eleanor dealing with their expectations after I'm gone. Thomas had seen it coming. He'd recognized the warning signs that I'd missed or chosen to ignore. He'd understood that our children viewed us as sources of financial support rather than human beings deserving of respect and consideration. And he'd worried about leaving me to handle their manipulation and greed alone. I closed the journal and returned it to the drawer, but Thomas's words stayed with me. He wouldn't have wanted me to sacrifice my security and dignity to appease children who refused to respect my autonomy. He would have supported my right to make my own decisions about our shared property. The next morning brought another surprise. Sarah called, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but her real agenda became clear within the first few minutes of conversation. "Mom, I talked to Michael last night, and he's really sorry about the misunderstanding. He knows he should have discussed the house sale with you first, but he was just trying to spare you the stress of making such a difficult decision." Misunderstanding. Even now, she was minimizing her brother's criminal behavior, trying to reframe fraud as poor communication. "Sarah, there was no misunderstanding. Michael forged my signature on legal documents and attempted to sell my property without my knowledge or consent. That's not a communication problem, it's a federal crime." "Mom, you're making this sound so much worse than it is. He made a mistake, and he's willing to apologize and make amends. But if you insist on involving the FBI and lawyers, you're going to destroy our entire family over money." "I'm not destroying anyone, Sarah. Michael destroyed our family trust when he decided to commit fraud rather than have an honest conversation about his financial concerns. But don't you think you're overreacting just a little bit? I mean, it's not like he actually sold the house. Nothing permanent happened. Can't you just forgive him and move on?" The gaslighting was so blatant, so shameless, that it took my breath away. She was trying to convince me that attempted fraud wasn't really a crime, that forgery was just a minor mistake, that my reaction to being victimized was more damaging than the victimization itself. "Sarah, if someone attempted to murder you but failed, would you consider that nothing permanent happened? If someone tried to steal your car but got caught before they could drive away, would you dismiss it as a minor mistake? Michael's failure to complete his fraud doesn't make his attempt any less criminal." "That's a terrible comparison, Mom. Murder and car theft are completely different from family financial disputes. This isn't a family financial dispute. This is elder abuse. And if you continue to defend and enable Michael's criminal behavior, you'll be complicit in any future attempts to defraud me." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had turned cold and calculating. "Mom, Michael and I have been talking, and we're worried about your mental state. This paranoid reaction to what was obviously a well-intentioned mistake suggests you might be experiencing some cognitive decline. Maybe you should talk to a doctor about getting evaluated." There it was, the nuclear option in family manipulation. When financial fraud and emotional blackmail failed to produce the desired result, the next step was to question my mental competence. If they could establish a pattern of concerning behavior and irrational decision-making, they might be able to petition for guardianship and gain legal control over my finances. "Sarah, I'm going to say this once, and I want you to listen carefully. My mental faculties are perfectly intact. I've been evaluated by my physician as recently as last month, and my cognitive function is normal for my age. Any attempt by you or Michael to challenge my competency will be met with fierce legal opposition, and I'll provide the court with documentation of this conversation as evidence of your attempt to manipulate me into accepting financial abuse." I hung up before she could respond. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire situation. I called Agent Rodriguez and asked her to meet me at the FBI office for an additional interview. When I arrived, she was waiting in the same conference room where we'd spoken before, but this time she was joined by a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office. "Mrs. Thompson, thank you for coming in. This is Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh. She'll be handling any potential prosecution in this case." A U.S. Attorney Walsh was a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her handshake was firm, and her manner was both professional and compassionate. "Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed the evidence in your case, and I want you to know that we take elder financial abuse very seriously. Your son's actions constitute multiple federal felonies, and the sophisticated nature of his scheme suggests this wasn't an impulsive decision but a carefully planned criminal enterprise. Ms. Walsh, I appreciate the government's concern for my welfare, but I'm still conflicted about pressing charges. Michael is my son, and despite what he's done, I don't want to destroy his life. I understand your feelings, Mrs. Thompson, and they're completely natural. Many victims of family financial abuse struggle with similar conflicts. But I want you to consider something. If your son faces no consequences for his actions, what's to prevent him from attempting something like this again? And what about other elderly victims who might not have your resources or awareness to protect themselves?" Her words hit home. Michael's sense of entitlement and his sophisticated fraud techniques didn't develop overnight. If he was willing to victimize his own mother, he'd certainly be willing to target strangers. By refusing to hold him accountable, I might be enabling him to prey on other vulnerable elderly people. "Ms. Walsh, if I decided to proceed with prosecution, what would happen to Michael? If convicted on all charges, he'd face between 3 and 5 years in federal prison, along with substantial fines and restitution. He'd also have a felony record that would affect his employment prospects and civil rights. However, if he were willing to plead guilty and cooperate fully, we might consider a reduced sentence that included probation and community service. And if I decided not to press charges? Then we'd have no choice but to close the investigation. Your son would face no consequences for his actions, and there would be nothing to prevent him from attempting similar fraud in the future." I left the meeting with a promise to make my decision within 48 hours. But as I drove home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, I realized my decision had already been made. Thomas's journal entry had crystallized something I'd been avoiding for years. Michael and Sarah didn't love me. They loved what they thought I could provide for them. Their concern for my welfare was always secondary to their concern for their own financial benefit. That evening, as I sat in my living room with a cup of tea and the Chicago Tribune crossword puzzle, my phone rang. It was Michael, and his voice sounded different, smaller, more desperate than I'd heard in years. "Mom, I need to talk to you. Can I come over?" "Michael, after what you've done, I don't think it's appropriate for you to be in my house without legal supervision. Please, Mom. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to explain. I'm your son. Doesn't that count for something?" Against my better judgment, I agreed to let him come over. But I also called Robert Klein and asked him to be present during the conversation. I wasn't going to face Michael's manipulation alone anymore. Michael arrived an hour later, and he looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands were shaking, and his clothes looked like he'd slept in them. When Robert arrived a few minutes later, Michael's demeanor changed from desperate to resentful. I asked to talk to my mother alone. "This is family business." "Michael," I said, settling into my favorite armchair, "your criminal behavior made this everyone's business. Robert is here to protect my interests and ensure that this conversation is properly documented." We sat in my living room, the same room where Michael had played with toy trucks as a child, where he'd practiced piano recitals as a teenager, where he'd announced his college acceptance and his first job promotion. Now he was sitting across from me as a federal criminal defendant, and the irony wasn't lost on any of us. Mom, I want you to know that I never intended to actually sell the house without telling you. I was just trying to get appraisals and market assessments so I could present you with options when you got back from New York. Even now, even facing federal prosecution, he couldn't tell the truth. The evidence clearly showed he'd attempted to complete the sale, not just gather information. But lying had become such an ingrained habit that he genuinely seemed to believe his own deceptions. Michael, the FBI has recordings of your phone calls to multiple real estate agencies. You specifically told them you had authority to sell the property immediately. You scheduled showings. You negotiated prices. That's not gathering information, that's attempting to complete a fraudulent transaction. His composure cracked, and for a few seconds, I saw the scared little boy he'd once been. Okay, you're right. I was desperate. The business is failing, and I'm facing bankruptcy. I thought if I could just get some equity out of the house, I could pay off my debts and start over. But I was going to split the money with you, Mom. It wasn't just for me. Michael, it's my house. If I wanted to access the equity, I'm perfectly capable of making that decision myself. You had no right to make financial decisions for me without my knowledge or consent. But I knew you'd say no if I asked. You always say no when I need help. And there it was, the core of his justification. He believed he had a right to my financial resources, and my refusal to provide unlimited funding justified fraud in his mind. He hadn't come to apologize or make amends, he'd come to explain why his criminal behavior was actually my fault. Robert leaned forward. Michael, you're admitting to premeditated fraud. You're acknowledging that you knew your mother wouldn't consent to the sale, so you decided to forge her signature and proceed without her knowledge. Do you understand that what you're describing is textbook elder abuse? Elder abuse? She's my mother, not some stranger. Families help each other. That's what families do. Families don't commit felonies against each other, I said quietly. Families don't forge signatures and attempt to steal property. Families don't manipulate and gaslight their elderly members. What you did wasn't family helping family, it was a criminal victimizing his mother. Michael's face flushed with anger. So that's it? You're really going to send me to prison? Your own son? I'm not sending you anywhere, Michael. Your choices brought you to this point. I'm simply refusing to protect you from the consequences of your criminal behavior. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Fine. But don't expect forgiveness when you realize what you've done to this family. Sarah will never speak to you again. Your grandchildren will grow up knowing you chose money over family. Is winning this argument worth losing everyone you love? The emotional blackmail was so transparent, so manipulative, that I almost laughed. He was threatening to withhold love and family relationships unless I agreed to let him victimize me with impunity. But his threats only confirmed what I already knew. His love had always been conditional on my willingness to provide financial support. Michael, if my family's love depends on my willingness to be victimized, then I've already lost them. And if my choice is between being respected or being loved by people who don't respect me, I choose respect. He left without another word, slamming the front door so hard that the stained glass panel rattled in its frame. Robert and I sat in silence for several minutes after Michael's departure. Finally, he spoke. Eleanor, you handled that very well. You stayed calm, you stuck to the facts, and you didn't let him manipulate you into changing your position. I feel like I just lost my son, I said, and the words came out more broken than I'd intended. No, Eleanor. You lost your son years ago, when he decided that your value as a person was measured by your value as a financial resource. What happened tonight was just the formal recognition of what's been true for a long time. 2 days later, I called AUS Attorney Walsh and told her I wanted to proceed with prosecution. The relief in her voice was evident. Mrs. Thompson, I think you're making the right decision, both for yourself and for other potential victims. We'll proceed with filing formal charges, and I'll keep you informed of all developments. The formal indictment was handed down 2 weeks later. Michael was charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. The local news media picked up the story, and suddenly my private family tragedy became public knowledge. The Chicago Tribune ran a front-page article under the headline, "Son charged with attempting to sell mother's $7.4 million Gold Coast home through fraud." The article was factual but embarrassing. It detailed Michael's business failures, his history of financial dependence on me, and the sophisticated nature of his fraud scheme. Neighbors who'd known our family for decades suddenly saw me as a victim of elder abuse rather than a respected member of the community. But the media attention also brought unexpected support. I received dozens of letters and phone calls from other elderly people who'd experienced similar victimization by their own adult children. Many of them thanked me for having the courage to press charges, saying they'd been too ashamed or frightened to report their own experiences with family financial abuse. Dr. Margaret Foster, a geriatrician at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, called to invite me to speak at a conference on elder abuse prevention. Mrs. Thompson, your case highlights patterns we see far too often in our practice. Adult children who view their elderly parents as sources of funding rather than human beings deserving of respect and autonomy. Your willingness to fight back could inspire other victims to seek help. The criminal case proceeded quickly. Michael's attorney negotiated a plea agreement that would spare him a lengthy prison sentence in exchange for a guilty plea and full restitution. Under the terms of the agreement, he would serve 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. He would also be required to pay a $25,000 fine and complete 200 hours of community service working with elder abuse prevention programs. But perhaps most importantly, the plea agreement included a provision that he would have no contact with me for 5 years without court supervision. I wouldn't have to worry about him attempting to manipulate or intimidate me while he served his sentence or during his probation period. The sentencing hearing was held on a cold December morning in the federal courthouse downtown. I sat in the gallery with Robert, watching as Michael stood before Judge Patricia Morrison to formally accept responsibility for his crimes. Mr. Thompson, Judge Morrison said, you've pleaded guilty to defrauding your own mother, a 73-year-old woman who trusted you with access to her home and personal documents. Elder financial abuse is particularly insidious because it exploits the natural trust that exists between family members. Your victims aren't strangers, they're people who love you and want to believe the best about your intentions. Michael stood silently as the judge pronounced his sentence. When she asked if he had anything to say, he turned and looked directly at me. I'm sorry, Mom. I know I've disappointed you, and I know I've lost your trust. I hope someday you can forgive me. His words sounded hollow and rehearsed, like something his attorney had coached him to say. There was no genuine remorse in his voice, no real understanding of the pain he'd caused. He was sorry he'd been caught, sorry he was facing consequences, but I didn't believe he was sorry for victimizing me. I left the courthouse feeling emotionally drained but strangely lighter. The legal system had validated my experience and held Michael accountable for his actions. I was no longer a victim, I was a survivor who'd fought back and won. Sarah called that evening, and her voice was cold with fury. I hope you're happy, Mom. You've destroyed Michael's life, and for what? A house you're too old to enjoy anyway. Sarah, Michael destroyed his own life when he chose to commit felonies rather than have an honest conversation about his financial problems. He's going to prison because of you. His children will grow up knowing their father is a criminal because their grandmother cared more about money than family. Sarah, if you continue to blame me for Michael's criminal behavior, then you're as morally corrupt as he is. I've done nothing but protect myself from fraud and theft. If you can't understand the difference between being victimized and being vindictive, then we have nothing more to discuss. I hung up on her for the second time in 2 months. That night, I walked through my house, seeing it with new eyes. The rooms felt different now that I knew I'd successfully protected them from theft. The family photographs on the mantelpiece told a different story than they had months earlier. What I'd once seen as happy memories now looked like evidence of a long con, decades of manipulation disguised as family affection. But I also felt a profound sense of relief. For the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about unexpected financial requests, guilt-inducing phone calls, or emotional manipulation disguised as family concern. I was free to make my own decisions about my property, my money, and my life. The months that followed were quieter but richer than I'd expected. Without the constant stress of managing Michael and Sarah's demands and crises, I had time and energy to rediscover interests I'd neglected for years. I started volunteering at a literacy program for adult learners. I joined a book club at the local library. I took painting classes at the Art Institute. Most surprisingly, I started dating again. James Morrison, no relation to the federal judge, was a retired history professor I'd met at the book club. He was 75, widowed for 3 years, and had his own difficult relationship with money-grubbing adult children. We understood each other's experiences with family financial abuse, and our shared trauma became the foundation for genuine companionship. James was everything Michael and Sarah were not. He was interested in my thoughts and opinions, not my bank account. He respected my independence and autonomy. He never asked me for money or suggested that I should change my living situation to accommodate his preferences. He treated me like an equal partner in our relationship rather than a resource to be managed and exploited. 6 months after Michael's sentencing, I received an unexpected visitor. Agent Rodriguez called to ask if she could stop by to discuss a related case. When she arrived, she was accompanied by a woman I didn't recognize. Mrs. Thompson, this is Detective Susan Clark from the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Division. She's investigating a case that might be related to your situation. Detective Clark explained that Michael had been suspected of similar fraud attempts targeting other elderly residents of the Gold Coast neighborhood. We believe he was using information gathered from working at his father's old engineering firm to identify wealthy elderly property owners who lived alone. Your case was probably just one of several he was planning. The revelation was both shocking and oddly comforting. Michael's fraud hadn't been a desperate response to financial crisis or a misguided attempt to help me. It had been part of a broader criminal enterprise targeting vulnerable elderly people. I wasn't just a family member he'd betrayed, I was a victim he'd selected for exploitation. Detective Clark, are you saying Michael was running some kind of elder fraud operation? We're still investigating, but the evidence suggests he was at least considering multiple targets. We found files in his computer containing property records and personal information for several dozen elderly residents of your neighborhood. Your case may have been a trial run for a larger scheme. The detective's words reframed everything I thought I understood about Michael's motivations. This wasn't just about a troubled son making bad decisions in a moment of financial desperation. This was about a predator who'd identified his own mother as suitable prey for a systematic fraud operation. But knowing the truth also brought a sense of vindication. My decision to press charges hadn't just protected me, it had potentially protected dozens of other elderly people who might have become victims of Michael's schemes. A year after the investigation began, I decided to sell the house after all, but on my own terms. The memories had been too tainted by Michael's betrayal for me to ever feel completely comfortable there again. Every room reminded me of his violation of my trust and privacy. I sold it for $7.6 million, significantly more than Michael had attempted to get in his fraudulent scheme. With the proceeds, I bought a beautiful 2-bedroom condominium in a high-rise overlooking Grant Park. The new place had no memories of betrayal, no rooms where family members had plotted against me, no spaces contaminated by deception and fraud. Most of the money went into a trust managed by Robert Klein, structured to provide me with comfortable income for the rest of my life while protecting the principal from any potential future fraud attempts. The trust also included substantial donations to elder abuse prevention organizations and legal aid societies that helped elderly victims of financial crime. But I kept enough to do something I'd dreamed about for years. I bought a small cabin in Wisconsin, on a lake where Thomas and I had spent our honeymoon 50 years earlier. It was a simple place, just 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it represented something Michael and Sarah had tried to steal from me, the freedom to make my own choices about how to spend my remaining years. James and I spent our first summer at the cabin together, reading books on the screened porch and taking long walks around the lake. We talked about our children, our disappointments, and our hopes for the time we had left. We cooked simple meals together and watched the sunset from the dock Thomas had built decades earlier. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced since before Thomas's illness. There were no unexpected phone calls asking for money, no guilt-inducing visits from children who saw me as a financial resource rather than a human being. There were just 2 people who'd survived family betrayal and found companionship in their shared understanding of what it meant to choose dignity over exploitation. Michael was released from federal prison after serving 14 months of his sentence. He was required to report to a halfway house in Milwaukee and complete his community service working with elder abuse prevention programs. The irony of requiring him to help other potential victims wasn't lost on anyone involved in the case. He sent me a letter after his release, forwarded through Robert's law office to comply with the no-contact provisions of his probation. The letter was predictably self-serving, full of apologies and promises to make amends once his legal restrictions were lifted. But it also contained a request that revealed he still didn't understand the true nature of his crimes. "Mom, I know I've lost your trust, and I know it will take time to rebuild our relationship. But I hope you'll reconsider the trust you've established with Robert's law firm. Those legal documents create unnecessary barriers between us, and I think they prevent the natural healing that should happen between family members. When my probation is completed, I'd like to discuss simplifying your estate planning so we can move forward together as a family." Even from prison, even after being convicted of defrauding me, he was still trying to gain access to my financial resources. The letter confirmed what I'd known for months: his apologies were hollow, his remorse was fabricated, and his understanding of family relationships was fundamentally transactional. I didn't respond to the letter. Sarah maintained her position that I had overreacted to Michael's mistake and destroyed our family over money. She sent occasional cards on holidays, but they were stiff and formal, signed with just her name and nothing else. She never asked about my health or my living situation. She never expressed interest in rebuilding our relationship. The cards felt like obligation rather than affection, duty rather than love. But her distance was actually a gift. Without her constant attempts to guilt me into accepting exploitation, I was free to develop relationships with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide for them. Mrs. Jenkins, my neighbor from across the street, became one of my closest friends. She was 81 years old, sharp as a tack, and had her own stories of adult children who viewed her as a burden rather than a blessing. We had lunch together every Tuesday, sharing gossip about the neighborhood and commiserating about the challenges of aging in a youth-obsessed culture. "Eleanor," she said one afternoon as we sat in her kitchen eating homemade blueberry pie, "you did something most people in our situation never manage. You stood up for yourself. You refused to be a victim. That takes more courage than most people possess." Her words meant more to me than any apology from Michael or Sarah ever could. Mrs. Jenkins understood what I'd been through because she'd survived similar experiences with her own children. Her validation came from lived experience rather than legal obligation or familial duty. Dr. Foster invited me to speak at 3 more conferences about elder financial abuse. Each time, I shared my story with audiences of medical professionals, social workers, and law enforcement officers who worked with elderly victims of family fraud. The response was always the same: gratitude for my willingness to speak publicly about a problem that usually remained hidden behind family shame and social stigma. After one conference in Detroit, a woman in her late 60s approached me during the reception. "Mrs. Thompson, your presentation gave me the courage to report my own son's financial abuse. He's been forging checks from my account for 6 months, and I was too embarrassed to tell anyone. But listening to your story made me realize that protecting him from consequences was just enabling him to continue victimizing me." Stories like hers reminded me why I'd chosen to prosecute Michael rather than try to resolve our dispute privately. Family financial abuse thrived in secrecy, protected by shame and misguided loyalty. By speaking publicly about my experience, I was helping other victims understand that they weren't alone and that they deserved better treatment from their families. James proposed to me on a September evening as we sat on the dock at the Wisconsin cabin. We were both in our 70s, both widowed, both survivors of family betrayal, but we'd found something authentic together that neither of us had expected at our age. Our love wasn't based on what we could provide for each other financially, it was based on genuine companionship and mutual respect. We had a small ceremony at the cabin the following spring, attended by Mrs. Jenkins, Robert Klein, and a few other friends who'd supported me through the darkest period of my life. There were no family members present, but their absence felt like freedom rather than loss. We were surrounded by people who loved us for who we were, not what we could provide for them. Michael's probation ended 2 years after his release from prison, but he never contacted me directly. I occasionally heard about him through mutual acquaintances in the neighborhood. His business ventures continued to fail, and his financial problems persisted, but he apparently found other sources of funding. I hoped he'd learn to leave elderly people alone, but I suspected his targeting of vulnerable victims had simply become more sophisticated. Sarah moved to California with her family, ostensibly for her husband's job but clearly also to escape the neighborhood gossip about our family's criminal scandal. She sent a Christmas card the first year after her move, but nothing after that. Her silence was the clearest indication that she'd never understood the difference between justice and vindictiveness, between consequences and cruelty. But their absence created space for new relationships and experiences I wouldn't have pursued while managing their constant demands and crises. James and I traveled to Ireland, visiting the country his grandparents had left during the potato famine. We took painting classes together at the local community college, and our amateur watercolors decorated the walls of both our homes. We volunteered together at a food bank, and the work gave us a sense of purpose and connection to our community. Most importantly, we modeled for each other what healthy relationships looked like in the later decades of life. We respected each other's independence and autonomy. We supported each other's interests and friendships. We shared financial responsibilities equitably without keeping score or maintaining obligation ledgers. We communicated directly about our needs and expectations rather than using manipulation and guilt to get what we wanted. On my 77th birthday, James threw me a surprise party at the cabin. The guests included Mrs. Jenkins, Robert Klein, Dr. Foster, and several other friends I'd made through my volunteer work and speaking engagements. It was a small gathering, but it was filled with people who genuinely cared about my happiness and well-being. As I looked around at the faces of my chosen family, I realized something profound had happened during the 5 years since Michael's arrest. I'd learned to distinguish between people who loved me and people who loved what I could provide for them. I discovered that respect was more valuable than conditional affection. I'd found the courage to prioritize my own dignity over family harmony. The betrayal that had once felt like the end of everything had actually been the beginning of a richer, more authentic life. By refusing to be victimized, I'd created space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. By choosing consequences over enablement, I'd protected other potential victims from the predator my son had become. The legal system had validated my experience and held my abuser accountable, but the real victory was personal. I'd reclaimed my autonomy, protected my resources, and built a life surrounded by people who valued me as a complete human being rather than a source of funding for their ambitions and failures. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, Mrs. Jenkins pulled me aside for a private moment. "Eleanor, do you ever regret the choices you made? Do you ever wonder if you should have forgiven Michael and tried to keep the family together?" I thought about her question for a moment, watching James help our other guests carry dishes to the kitchen. "Mary, I don't regret protecting myself from fraud and abuse. I don't regret holding a criminal accountable for his crimes. And I don't regret choosing dignity over exploitation. The family we had wasn't worth keeping because it wasn't based on love or respect. What we have now is better because it's authentic." She squeezed my hand and smiled. "That's what I thought you'd say. And that's why you're one of the strongest people I know." That night, as James and I sat on the dock watching stars reflect on the still water of the lake, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since before Thomas's illness. The sounds were different now, loons calling across the water instead of traffic on Oak Street, gentle lapping of waves instead of the constant urban hum of Chicago. But the silence was comfortable rather than lonely, companionable rather than isolating. "James," I said, leaning against his shoulder, "do you think we would have found each other if we hadn't both survived betrayal by our children?" He considered the question thoughtfully before responding. "I think our pain made us recognizable to each other. We both learned the difference between love and manipulation, between family and exploitation. That shared understanding is part of what makes this work." His words captured something essential about our relationship and about the unexpected gifts that had emerged from the worst period of my life. By surviving family betrayal, I developed the wisdom to recognize authentic love when I found it. By refusing to accept exploitation, I'd created the emotional space necessary for healthy relationships. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been liberating. It had forced me to examine the difference between being loved and being used, between being valued and being exploited. It had taught me that family relationships, like all relationships, must be based on mutual respect to be genuinely meaningful. Looking back now, I can see that Michael and Sarah had been exploiting me for years before the attempted house sale. The fraud was just the most blatant example of a pattern that had been developing for decades. They'd viewed me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected, a source of funding rather than a human being deserving of consideration and dignity. By refusing to accept their treatment, by holding them accountable for their actions, I'd broken a cycle of exploitation that might have continued for the rest of my life. I'd also created an opportunity for them to develop genuine character and authentic relationships, though they'd chosen not to take advantage of that opportunity. As I write this, 8 years have passed since Michael's arrest. I'm 81 years old, in excellent health, and surrounded by people who love me for who I am rather than what I can provide for them. James and I have been married for 6 years, and our relationship continues to be a source of joy and companionship. The cabin has become our primary residence, though we maintain the condominium in Chicago for medical appointments and cultural activities during the winter months. We've created a life that's simple but rich, focused on experiences and relationships rather than accumulation and achievement. Michael has apparently rebuilt his life to some extent. I heard through neighborhood contacts that he eventually found steady employment with a construction company and remarried a woman with her own financial resources. I hope he's learned to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation, but I have no direct knowledge of his circumstances and no desire for contact. Sarah has remained in California, and I know nothing about her current situation. The silence between us has become permanent, and I've accepted that our relationship was probably never as authentic as I'd believed during her childhood and young adulthood. The love I thought existed may have been conditional on my willingness to provide financial support and accept manipulation as normal family interaction. But their absence has created space for relationships that are genuinely meaningful. Mrs. Jenkins remained a close friend until her death last year at age 89. Dr. Foster and I continue to work together on elder abuse prevention programs, and our professional collaboration has evolved into a genuine friendship. The people I've met through volunteer work and speaking engagements have become a chosen family that values authenticity over obligation. The most important lesson I've learned is that respect is the foundation of all healthy relationships. Love without respect is manipulation. Family without respect is exploitation. Loyalty without respect is enabling. By insisting on respect from my children, I lost relationships that were ultimately hollow, but I gained self-respect that has sustained me through the challenges of aging. I often think about other elderly people who might be experiencing similar situations with their own families. Financial abuse of the elderly is far more common than most people realize, and it's particularly devastating when perpetrated by trusted family members. Victims are often ashamed to report the abuse because it forces them to acknowledge that their children don't genuinely love them, that their family relationships are transactional rather than emotional. But silence protects the abusers more than it protects the victims. By speaking publicly about my experience, I've tried to normalize the decision to hold family members accountable for criminal behavior. Love doesn't require accepting abuse, and family loyalty doesn't require sacrificing personal dignity. The criminal justice system worked in my case because I had the resources and support to pursue prosecution. Many elderly victims lack the financial means to hire attorneys, the emotional support to endure lengthy legal proceedings, or the cognitive awareness to recognize that they're being victimized. That's why community education and prevention programs are so important. I continue to speak at conferences and community events, sharing my story and encouraging other potential victims to seek help when they suspect financial exploitation. The response is always intense and emotional, with audience members sharing their own stories of family betrayal and manipulation. After one presentation in Minneapolis, a man in his 60s approached me with tears in his eyes. "Mrs. Thompson, my mother is 85, and I've been pressuring her to sell her house so she can pay for my daughter's college tuition. Listening to your story made me realize what I was doing to her. I'm going to apologize and support whatever decision she makes about her property." Stories like his give me hope that education and awareness can prevent some families from experiencing the trauma we endured. Not every case of financial pressure becomes criminal fraud, but the underlying attitudes about elderly autonomy and family entitlement are often similar. The most painful aspect of my experience wasn't the financial fraud itself, but the realization that my children had never truly respected my autonomy or valued my dignity. They'd seen me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. That recognition was devastating, but it was also liberating because it allowed me to stop trying to earn love from people who were incapable of providing it authentically. Recovery from family betrayal is different from recovery from other types of trauma because it requires rebuilding fundamental assumptions about trust, loyalty, and love. The people who were supposed to protect and cherish you were actually the ones exploiting and manipulating you. Learning to trust again, to open your heart to new relationships, requires tremendous courage and wisdom. But recovery is possible, and it can lead to relationships that are deeper and more meaningful than anything you experienced before. When you stop accepting exploitation as love, you create space for authentic affection. When you insist on respect as the foundation of relationships, you attract people who are capable of genuine caring. James often says that our marriage is stronger because we both learn to recognize the difference between love and manipulation. We don't take each other's respect for granted because we both know what it feels like to be devalued and exploited by people who claim to care about us. The house on Oak Street was sold years ago, but I occasionally drive past it when I'm in Chicago for medical appointments or cultural events. The new owners have made changes, different paint colors, new landscaping, updated windows, but the basic structure remains the same. It's still a beautiful building in a prestigious neighborhood, still worth millions of dollars, still capable of housing a family's dreams and memories. But it no longer represents my identity or my security. It's just a building now, beautiful but impersonal, valuable but not irreplaceable. My security comes from the relationships I've built, the respect I've earned, and the dignity I've protected. Those assets can't be stolen through fraud or lost through market fluctuations. As I approach my 82nd birthday, I'm grateful for the unexpected path my life has taken. The betrayal that once seemed like the end of everything was actually the beginning of a more authentic existence. By refusing to accept exploitation, I discovered what genuine love could feel like. By insisting on respect, I created space for relationships based on mutual appreciation rather than financial dependency. The cabin where I'm writing this story sits on the same lake where Thomas and I spent our honeymoon 53 years ago. The water is still crystal clear, the loons still call across the surface at dusk, and the sunset still paints the sky in shades of pink and gold that take my breath away. But I'm a different person than the young bride who first visited this place, and I'm a different person than the betrayed mother who almost lost everything to her son's greed. I'm a survivor who chose dignity over family harmony, respect over conditional love, authenticity over comfortable lies. I'm a woman who learned that you're never too old to start over, to build new relationships, to insist on being treated with the consideration you deserve. I'm proof that betrayal doesn't have to be permanent defeat, that exploitation doesn't have to define the rest of your story. If you're listening to this story and recognizing similarities to your own situation, I want you to know that you deserve better. You deserve respect from your family members. You deserve honesty in your relationships. You deserve autonomy over your own decisions and resources. You don't owe anyone access to your financial assets in exchange for their affection, and you don't have to accept manipulation as a normal part of family interaction. Seeking help isn't betraying your family, it's protecting yourself. Holding family members accountable for criminal behavior isn't being vindictive, it's insisting on basic human dignity. Choosing respect over exploitation isn't destroying your family, it's creating space for authentic relationships to develop. The support systems exist to help you: elder abuse hotlines, legal aid societies, victim assistance programs, counseling services. You don't have to navigate this alone, and you don't have to accept being victimized as the price of maintaining family relationships. Most importantly, you don't have to sacrifice your dignity to purchase love from people who are incapable of providing it authentically. Real love doesn't require you to accept abuse. Real family loyalty doesn't demand that you enable criminal behavior. Real respect doesn't come with conditions and obligations that leave you feeling exploited and diminished. The best years of my life began when I stopped accepting less than I deserved from the people who claimed to care about me. Recovery is possible. Respect is achievable. Authentic relationships exist, but you have to create space for them by refusing to accept the counterfeit versions that masquerade as love while actually being exploitation. Your story doesn't have to end with betrayal. Mine didn't. With courage, support, and a commitment to your own dignity, you can write a new chapter that's based on respect, authenticity, and genuine caring. You deserve nothing less, and it's never too late to insist on better. Have you ever lived through something similar, or do you know someone who has faced family betrayal like this? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to protect themselves. If this story touched you or reminded you of someone who needs to hear it, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. When we share these difficult truths, we help break the silence that allows family abuse to continue. Together, we can create a world where every elderly person is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for understanding that choosing dignity over exploitation isn't selfish, it's necessary. And thank you for helping me prove that our most painful experiences can become the foundation for our most meaningful victories.